I'd like to thank Americans United for Life and Bill Saunders in particular for the invitation to address you today. Also, to thank the other speakers that have gone before us and have really paved the way. In fact, taken away quite a bit of what I was going to say, so this will be a much shorter talk than it originally was, but I'm still grateful that those points have been made. I turned 18, so I realize I'm giving away my age, but so be it. I turned 18 in 1973. And so these 40 years since Roe versus Wade coincide with the 40 years of my adult life, those 4 decades. I would call it my mature life, but there are some people here who know me, so. And with your indulgence, I'd like to offer a kind of brief overview or characterization of the pro-life movement during those 4 decades. I realize this could just end up being autobiographical, but I hope not. I hope there's some resonance out there. And so I want to divide up into the 4 decades, and I'm calling them in order. The 70s, I believe the movement was blindsided. In the 80s, we became battle ready. In the 90s, we were besieged. And in the 2000s, or the aughts, bewildered. And then I want to say about the future of Roe that I think it will be brief. All right, so I hope to get to that shortly. In the 70s, I believe many of us were just blindsided by the decision itself, and then by how fast, how quickly it changed the cultural landscape, how quickly it revised our understanding of human life, of women, what women really needed, and so forth. All the state laws restricting abortion in any way were instantly null and void, of course. And this last Monday, on the anniversary of Roe, the Boston Globe had an article reporting that Massachusetts, of all places, still has an antiquated law that makes it a crime for a doctor to perform an abortion, punishable by up to 7 years in prison. So if Roe were overturned tomorrow, this law would take effect. You can imagine how frantic some people are getting here. They want to definitely get that one off the books. And abortion on demand here became, in the language of the court, in effect, a human right, a basic human right, predicated on the right to privacy, which sounds kind of serious and deep. Most of us feel that many of the things about our lives are private. I think Americans are particularly sensitive about that. And so if you could kind of fold it into that, it had a certain, sense to it, where it seemed to make sense to many people. I think also, at least for myself and maybe both sides of the debate, I think we're amazed, kind of blindsided by the immediate escalation, massive escalation in the number of abortions. Many people thought, well, legalizing it isn't going to make that much difference. How many women are actually going to seek an abortion? In 1973, and this is according to the Guttmacher Institute, there were about 745,000 abortions. In 1979, it was 1,500,000 abortions. So it more than doubled in 6 years, the numbers of abortions, making this a kind of major cultural shift, it seems to me. So in the 1980s, I think the pro-life movement kind of regrouped. I'm calling it the battle-ready decade, and came up with several strategies for combating Roe versus Wade and abortion on demand. One of them was to attack the wobbly legal reasoning behind that decision, and I think Clark Forsythe did a very good job of that, explaining that it had no real underpinning in the law, it had no real underpinning in philosophy or pretty much any other academic subject. It was just a kind of fiat decision. Secondly, of course, there had been powerful lobbying groups formed to support abortion. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, of course, many of them funded by the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. So the comment that Jerry Bradley made, the power is blocking the progress of the pro-life movement, that's very true, and money is power. Right? Certainly the political scene is very important to the legislative realm, but there's a lot of money behind abortion, and there always has been. There's been a lot of money behind eugenics programs and curbing population overseas and the like. But in response then, we found the kind of formation or the reactivization, you might say, of many pro-life groups as well. I mean, Americans United for Life had been around since 1971, so they were the old guard, and National Right to Life committee founded in 1968. But in a way, you didn't hear the voices as loudly as you began to hear them, I think, in the 80s. The March for Life had been going on since '74 and has grown in numbers remarkably ever since. Human Life International, and evangelical Christians kind of came on board in the 80s, around 1980, I believe. So there was an attempt, at least, to organize as a movement, to raise money, to lobby, every front, right, philosophically, to defend arguments in favor of the humanity of the unborn child, and a lot of legal action, I think, as well, which is important. The Roe Court professed a kind of ignorance about the beginnings of human life, and for a long time, I think, we thought we could easily counter this with education, right? It's easy. Beginnings of human life, just open your biology book, and if we sort of showed this to people, they would all get it, and that would kind of solve the problem. Well, it didn't, but we tried. Okay, there were a lot of efforts and a lot of, not just efforts, but a lot of activity there on educating the public. There was also an increasing callousness, of course, towards life in the womb as way it was described by the pro-abortion movement, very dismissive, sometimes as though it didn't exist. And so there was also a response to that on the part of the pro-life movement. Appeals to conscience, showing maybe descriptions of abortion, even pictures of aborted fetuses. Not everybody agreed with every one of these strategies, but the point was, I think, to reveal the face of the unborn child, to the humanity of the unborn child. In the 1990s, however, I think the movement felt besieged and a little bit overwhelmed, I suppose, by noticing that these strategies weren't making a whole lot of headway. And that was puzzling and also felt, it was a setback, you might say. I think the pro-life movement wasn't sure what to make of it. I think we became very fractured as a movement, in part debating over strategy. There was a multiplication, sometimes duplication of resources and that kind of thing. And the Casey decision put the right to abortion on a different footing, maybe a more foundational footing of liberty, appealing to liberty rights, also to the equality of women. The equality of women argument seems to me not as persuasive just because it's a kind of pragmatic thing that, Sandra Day O'Connor arguing that the equality of women requires access to abortion. Now, she's in her 80s now, so she was in her 40s when Roe v. Wade was enacted, at a time in her life when she was no doubt pushing her own career and so forth. And that generation, probably all the way down to mine, she's fortunately, I can say, older than me, so it's possible. We came from a generation that thought women really had to prove themselves to be the equals of men. The only way to do that was to be just like men in every respect. It never occurred to us that men should sort of take us seriously as women. Why would they? It was a weird kind of, lack of esteem, but also a kind of pushing for proving that we could be, reasonable facsimile of a man. And I felt that pressure myself. One of the first women, I suppose, in a while to go into philosophy. Along with that, of course, we had the National Organization of Women who, since then, have made abortion, I think, their main mission in life. That wasn't true in the 70s and 80s. You look on their website of now, key highlights, in the history of now. At first, it's all about equal pay, equal rights amendment, so forth, violence against women, what we can do about it. And then suddenly, it's more and more about two things. Abortion has to be defended as a basic right, and the gay and lesbian movement has to be defended. All right, so these two things kind of go hand in hand. 1 year it's progress on lesbian rights, the next year it's abortion rights. And I think by now, since there's so many other groups pushing gay rights and so on, this has become their one and only issue of the National Organization of Women. It's really, they practically worship abortion rights, Roe v. Wade. It's bizarre, it's an ideological thing. It is not necessarily a rational thing. They're just totally committed to it. Women have to have this, or they won't be able to compete with men and be reasonable facsimiles of men. It just isn't going to happen. Right, in response to that, I think positively, a lot of women took leadership roles in the pro-life movement. Up until then, we had seen some women, certainly at the helm, but we'd seen also a lot of men speaking for the pro-life view. We'd seen bishops and priests speaking for it. And I think we realized that if the National Organization of Women is going to present abortion as the real women's position, pro-choice and so forth, we had to have women who could articulate another view, another kind of pro-woman view. And thanks be to God for the women who took it on, Helen Alvarez being one of the main ones, Charmaine Yost and Marianne Glendon and many others that we owe, I think, a great debt to. Because, yeah, thank you. All right, now I think in the 2000s, moving along here, I call them the bewildered era, because this is when we realized that appeal to reason, like you had with Hadley Arcus, for example, is just kind of obvious. The unborn child is a human being and has natural rights because it's naturally a human being. Every human being is a human person endowed with rights. That's a kind of default view, the common sense view. How could there be a difference between a human being and a human person? A person is something with a rational nature, so is a human being. Ergo, you're basically talking about the same category. This was just plain denied for 20 years, I think, in the debate. And then for 20 more years, it was declared irrelevant. So we finally won, you might say, on the personhood or the humanity, even the personhood of the unborn child. And then that didn't do the trick. People just declared that irrelevant. Yeah, it's a human being, but the woman's right to choose, you know, to pick her career or her desires and so forth over the life of the child is just sacrosanct. We can't mess with it. And I think this is kind of astonishing for many of us. I call it bewildered. I was pretty much stunned, I think, by that development. Finally, then, what's the future for Roe? Well, I believe we have many reasons to be very encouraged and to believe that the future of Roe will be brief. I will try to state these as quickly as possible. First of all, I think the rise of social media. 3D videos of babies are appearing on YouTube. My niece sent me one, you know, 2 or 3 minutes of a little baby kicking around in there, and to all of her friends. Right? Is that not a human person? Kind of looks like one. Here's our child, we're naming him this, and so on. In fact, I got a Christmas card this year from someone who gave pictures of each one of the kids, and the last picture was a sonogram picture of, and with the name and all of that, our little boy on the way. Well, you know, how long can Roe v. Wade and the denial of the rights of the unborn withstand these kinds of things? You look on Twitter, type in abortion on Twitter. Almost all the comments you read, and they're from young people, of course, all right? Not that many of us gray hairs are on Twitter. We don't tweet that much. So in the Tweeterverse or Twitterverse or whatever it is, almost all the remarks are pro-life. And I think that Jer has definitely pointed out the intellectual bankruptcy of the personhood scam. I call it a scam, and it really is. Philosophers are very aware of that, I think. I think having the Human Life Amendment back on the table, I was so stunned when they put that on the Republican Party's platform. I had not heard the phrase Human Life Amendment in years. Everybody always told me, I thought this would be a great idea, and they go, shh, don't be silly. That's never going to happen. So when I heard it was on the agenda, I mean, my mouth just fell open for several minutes. I was speechless. Practically a miracle in my case. I could not think of what to say. I was amazed. And also, I think there's a wonderful new feminism amongst the younger women today, a new feminism that is really very much compatible with what, in fact, almost exactly embodying what John Paul II called for as a different way of seeing it. And here I'd just like to quote in closing Naomi Wolf again, who in 2001, some years after the New Republic article, became pregnant unexpectedly and wrote a book, of course, being Naomi Wolf. She wrote a book about it. And in the 9th month, she was adamantly pro-choice at the beginning. In her 9th month of pregnancy, she says this, and keep in mind the background of the whole liberty thing. Gradually, I began to see things differently than I had before. I noticed in a different way the pointlessness of the traditionally male model of performance and autonomy at all costs. I came to feel that it was brutal to be content with a feminism that was compelled to fit into this traditionally masculine definition of accomplishment. True revolution, it slowly seemed clear to me, would come about only when we demanded that the world conform to our needs as women. Society must restructure itself radically to support babies and new parents, too. Stopping short of that meant that no revolution deep enough had been achieved. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.